Hi, welcome to Benny's Book Club. I'm Allie House, joined by Maddie Baker, Ashlyn Kuntz, and Carlin Blash. Today we're discussing the book Bloodsworth by Tim Junkin. This book tells the tale of Kirk Bloodsworth, a man who was wrongfully convicted of the rape and murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton. After 9 years of jail time, DNA evidence showed Bloodsworth was innocent. He was exonerated on June 28, 1993. This book not only talks about Bloodsworth's personal experiences with jail, juries, and the justice system, but also talks about the logistics of Maryland's laws. Bloodsworth switches between telling harrowing personal accounts of Kirk Bloodsworth's trials and objectively recalling evidence, laws, and precedents surrounding the case. Many think the book's bluntness is offensive and too mature for many readers, while others think the arguments presented in the book are compelling. Personally, I like how the book saw quick changes in tone, going from emotional scenes straight into cold analyses of other events. I think this helped the book, as it seemed to sort of reflect what lawyers went through when dealing with the case. But that's just my 2 cents. What do you guys think?
I personally liked the book because I think it gave a detailed account of Bloodsworth's arrest and the evidence that led to his conviction. And whenever I was reading it, I just found it crazy that there was little clear evidence that pointed to him as being the killer, but the juries found enough evidence to convict him. And the description of the trials, I thought, personally lost my attention a bit because it was just too technical. And it was definitely interesting to see how the evidence was presented, but it was just the same evidence we already knew, and it was just too factual to capture my attention. But I think if you're someone that likes law or logical reads, it could definitely appeal to you.
Yeah, I thought that Bloodsworth was okay. I enjoyed the plot because it was very fascinating when it comes to the aspect of law corruption, like you said, and like the process of murder cases, because I am someone who finds law interesting. So in that sense, it was a good read. However, like in my opinion, the book moved very slowly, and there were parts where it would go on about details, such as like the history of Baltimore or the water, which is relevant in a way to the plot, but it added like very little, in my opinion, and like it was really run on. And I also thought that some of the evidence and detail that the author used was very repetitive. Like when they were talking about the eyewitnesses, a lot of the information was said over and over. So that kind of got boring to me and very dragged on. But with that being said, I believe it was still a good read with the whole law corruption aspect.
I agree with Ashlyn. This book really didn't catch my attention in any way, and I believe it was very boring in most of the parts of it. In the beginning of it, I was somewhat interested in what Kirk's story was, but as it progressed, I kind of got lost. I feel like the author gives way too much information about the case at a very fast pace, and most of the information is repeated throughout the whole book. But I think it would have been more interesting if they added more detail about I don't know what I said.
Restart the sentence.
About the murder scene and conviction rather than talking about the history and water.
Or can you redo that sentence? It's easier to
Wait, hold on. Let me figure out what I meant.
You give it rape, but you said
Hold on.
That's a wrap.
I also think it would have been more interesting if they added more detail about the rape and murder scene and conviction rather than talking about the history and water.
And I think that brings us into a good point. They do talk a lot about the water, I think, to develop the setting. So, like, we know that's Maryland and specifically more the Baltimore area, but how do you think a change in the setting would have affected the outcome of the case?
So, obviously this book took place in the 80s, and this was kind of a conservative time for a lot of states. So, I really don't think that there would have been that drastic of a difference. Like, obviously today we think of, conservative states versus more liberal states, but back then, most states were pretty much, like, in favor of the death penalty. That being said, some regions kind of were more in favor than others. Like, in southern regions, there were something like 2 death penalties sentenced in the South, while in, like, the Midwest and, like, northeastern states, it wasn't nearly that many. So I think that maybe, I'm inclined to say that maybe it would have been more severe in other states, but then I think that because of the nature of the crime that he committed, so many people were so passionate and so angry about it that I don't think a change in setting would have really done that much, since people were so angry in a place where is more liberal, for the time. So I really don't think that it would have been that different in another place.
I think that the setting could have changed it a bit if it took place in a state that had a shorter amount of time between whenever someone's sentenced to death and then whenever the execution actually happens. Because Bloodsworth in the story was on death row for 2 years, and that gave him enough time to find enough evidence to appeal his trial, and that essentially saved his life, because if he wouldn't have had that large gap of time, then he wouldn't have had the second trial and he wouldn't have been taken off death row, and then eventually been able to get the DNA evidence and prove that it wasn't him.
I agree with you, Carlin. I think that the state of Maryland gives way too much time to individuals who don't deserve it. Since he spent 2 years on death row before being resentenced to life in prison, and throughout all those years, he insisted he was an innocent man. It gave him more time to decide what he wanted to do, and his situation would have indeed been very different if it was in a different setting.
Yeah, I'm not too sure on death penalty laws from state to state because I don't really know much about that, but I think that it would have been different considering, like you said, Maryland is more liberal than the majority of southern states, so if it was anywhere in the south, then Bloodsworth definitely would have been dealing with stricter penalty laws, and like you said, he would be dealing with death row either way, but I think that it just would have been more severe. However, I think it's interesting how Maryland now doesn't even have the death penalty, so went from, with this case, having gas chamber to nothing, so clearly the time period also has a lot of effect, as well as the setting on his story, because if this would have happened today, he wouldn't be dealing with the death penalty at all, which would have drastically changed the case in general, so it just is a different outlook, which I think is interesting to see how time period can have a big effect on a story. But speaking of this, I think that we should switch bases to discuss conflicts present in this book. So
I know one conflict that I picked up on was man versus world, and that's because the police arrest Bloodsworth for this crime that he didn't commit just based on the little physical evidence that they have, and so the whole world sees him as being a rapist and a murderer, and once he was convicted by 2 juries, more and more people began to feel that way, and so he had to basically fight against the entire world and their what they thought, while also attempting to win his trials and gain the evidence that proved he was innocent.
yeah, and along with man versus world, there was also a lot of man versus self conflict, because in the beginning of the novel, Bloodsworth apologized to his lawyers for his appearance. He stated that the way he looked, which was buff and tough and very big, I guess, was not who he actually was. He had to appear a certain way in the prison to stay alive because of the other inmates, which also deals with man versus world. This creates a conflict with himself that is present throughout the entire novel because he changes and becomes a new person who he doesn't like because of the prison and the environment he's in, which also leads to another conflict of having to defend himself in the prison, as even though he wasn't the rapist or murderer that he was being said he was being, the other prisoners don't like him and they do see him that way. So at one point in the story, they even throw their urine into his cell, so not only does he have to deal with changes in himself and how the world is viewing him, but he also has to deal with how he is treated on a day-to-day basis in his new life and deal with that conflict as well.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think that's actually what makes the novel so, I guess, unique, is that it's categorized not by one conflict, but by all of these different conflicts. So it's written in a way to sort of show how many things are going against Bloodsworth, to sort of paint him as the underdog, to show how the press is against him and how the prosecuting lawyers are against him and how he's against himself, like Carlin said, or like Ashlyn said. And this is a very logistical book, and I think that's what makes the conflicts in it so unique, is that these emotional conflicts are incorporated in a way where they're not emotional, if that makes any sense. The conflicts are there, and he writes them in a way where you're supposed to think they're emotional, but the way he writes it is so cold and analytical and so detached that there's a conflict going on, but you don't really feel the, I guess, emotional intensity of what Bloodsworth himself is maybe feeling when the conflicts were actually going on. So I think it kind of helped the tone of the book in a way. It really helped solidify that hard, analytical tone that Junkin was going for when he wrote this. So I think that addition to the conflict really helped give concrete support to the tone of the novel.
Going off of the conflicts, I want to discuss a little more about the themes throughout the book.
So one main theme that I noticed in the novel was that the law does not always serve justice, which was exceptionally prevalent in Bloodsworth's case. And I remember one point in the novel when he was being taken into like the questioning room that the law enforcement was kind of planting evidence like in front of him. Like they put the little girl's panties in the table and they put the murder weapon, and